Good evening to all. This is Ashok Kamath from the IIT Alumni Center in Bengaluru. And welcome to, I believe, our 43rd webinar since April 2020. Something that we started when the pandemic hit, but we see so much value out of this, that so many people are benefiting, that we are continuing this well into the endemic stage from the pandemic stage. Today we have a couple of interesting people on the panel, and the format is going to be somewhat different from what we've done traditionally. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. K.V. Subramanian, poster boy in the Indian context, IIT, IIM, MBA and PhD from Chicago, Booth. Like Narayan said in an email to him this morning, you know, the ideal son-in-law in the Indian context. But what I find very exciting about his profile from LinkedIn are two things that is very dear to the IIT Alumni Center, which is his emphasis on ethical values and creating wealth. And the second one was this blueprint from the Economic Survey 2019, I believe, when he talked about the strategic plan for building a $5 trillion economy. For those members who attended our February 2020 Industry IIT Conclave, they will remember that the whole thing was hinged around what can IITians do to make this a $5 trillion economy. So that's the background of Subbu, the Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India. He's very close to finishing his 3-year term as the Chief Economic Advisor, and will be, demitting office and going back to his, role in the academic world. And an interesting thing is that in response to his tweet saying that he's planning to return back to academia, the Honorable Prime Minister tweeted by saying that it's been a delight to work with him, and his academic brilliance, unique perspectives on key economic as well as policy matters, and reformist zeal are noteworthy, wishing him the very best for his coming endeavors. So that was a tweet from the Honorable Prime Minister. Dr. Subramanian, welcome to the webinar. Moderating more like, in conversation with him today is another dear friend, Narayan Ramchandran, alumnus of IIT Bombay and then an MBA from the University of Michigan. And many exciting feathers in his cap. Head of Morgan Stanley in this country for the longest time, chairman of RBL Bank, founder of Include Labs, and I know that he's got something, a SPAC in the US that's called Clued In, right? Which is not Include, but Clued In. And those, many of you will be familiar with his writing frequently in the Mint. He has a regular column out there. And not only does he have a column, I think many of those things have been compiled into books. I believe volume 2 is out. He's probably working on the 3rd and the 4th. So many different hats, 2 exciting speakers. Let me, before handing it over to Narayan, let me just tell our viewers, please put all your questions in the Q&A box only, not in the chat box, because that's the Q&A boxes where we will be monitoring it. And, I'm sure there will be lots of questions, especially on economic reforms, that we'll have Subbu answer. Also, no certificates for attending this. We've had this query before, and so I, almost awkwardly have to mention this. This will be recorded, and you will have it up on YouTube on Monday. So for those who have missed it or missed parts of it, or if you want to share it with other people, that's your vehicle. On the IIT Alumni Center Bengaluru YouTube channel, you will find the videos of all of our webinars, and you can go there, or you can also go to the IITACB.org site and it will take you to the videos. With that, Narayan, all in your hands.
Thank you, Ashok, and it's a real pleasure to be here in conversation with Dr. Subramanian. Subbu, it's fantastic that you agreed to join us. You've had a storied career, well known to everyone in the last few years, but even before that. We'll get to that in just a second, but let me for a moment start with the future rather than the past. So what next for Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian? Are you more research, more academia, technocratic politics, real politics, RBI?
Thank you very much, Narayan, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me, Ashok, Sushila, and all the others for inviting me to share my thoughts. That's a loaded question, up front, very first. Let me put it this way. There is a song in the movie Shankara Bharanamu. This is the final song, which I actually am very, very fond of, which goes as Dorakuna Ituvanti Seva, which is, will I get the opportunity ever to do a service like this? That's the way I have actually lived my life. Every opportunity that one gets is really to serve this nation. One of the reasons I decided to, my family decided to come back from the United States is that, I never lost, or the fact that a taxpayer paid for my 4 years of education at IIT, with me just paying 365 rupees per semester at a time when it was costing about 2 lakhs for us to be educated in the IITs. That fact was never ever lost on me. And I think in that spirit, and this may sound like a cliche, but I actually mean every word of it. For me, it is about the opportunity to get to serve the country. I think it's such a privilege. Another wonderful Carnatic song that comes to my mind, this is Tyagaraja, who actually said, Endaro Mahanubhavalu Andariki na Vandanamulu, which is, there are so many great people. I bow down to all of them. So among so many great people, to actually get an opportunity to contribute is indeed just a genuine privilege. So I will say that, I would, whatever opportunity comes to contribute to the country, be it in the form of research, be it in the form of writing books, or others, I would actually love to do that. But I think, in terms of what really sort of really keeps me ticking, what I'm incredibly passionate about is ideas. I worked for 2 years after my MBA, and then decided to go for a PhD. At that time, had to sort of disrupt a lot, was doing very well in the job that I was in. My wife had to quit her job. And so, a lot of disruptions, only because this is what I actually am, incredibly passionate about, ideas, and bringing ideas, because I genuinely believe that, even after one's bones are interred to the earth, I think ideas can still remain. And just thinking about ideas, crafting them, chiseling them, with rigorous thought. These are what actually, really make me wake up in the morning, actually to live that day. Which is also another aspect. Actually, I don't try to look too much forward. The here and now. Actually, just enjoy what you do. My advisor had this wonderful parallel. When he gave this his convocation address at IIM Ahmedabad, his alma mater. Raghu, I'm talking about Dr. Rajan. He mentioned that if you have this choice between traveling and take the car of your pick, be it Lexus or BMW, Merc, whatever, you're going in that car, but you're not looking forward to that day's work. Vis-a-vis, you're actually maybe driving in a dilapidated bicycle, but getting up in the morning wanting to get to work. I think the choice should be very clear about what is, in the former, everybody else outside might think that you're having a gala time, but you're not having a gala time. In the latter, everybody else may think that you're a loser, but you're having a gala time. And I think it is important to live life based on what we think. And if we need to have gala time, it's not as important that others think whether we're having a gala time or not. These are the credos that I've lived by, and therefore, I think I will continue to do so going forward as well.
So thanks for that. Let me switch to the other end actually. So I'll let me see where the Subbu who's interested in ideas actually came about. So tell us about your early education. Already Ashok told us about the fact that we could borrow some of your credentials if you wanted to ghost write the proper ad in Bharat Matrimony. So we won't do that, particularly since you're in Hyderabad. I'm told that happens quite often. But regardless, tell us, you grew up in Bhilai, and then what took you to a little west from Bhilai, I suspect, to Kanpur, and then truly west. So chalk that journey for us and go ahead.
Well, maybe, even I would have loved to borrow this, whatever this compliment. I think it's come 20 years too late. Maybe 20 years, earlier actually might have been more useful. But jokes apart, see, unlike most people, most folks that, so when I, for instance, go into my office in North Block and I look at that board that has, very famous names there, and I look across that board, I think, one thing that gives me incredible satisfaction is that I have come from a very, very humble background. I'm the first person in my entire clan, both on the mother and father's side, to have gone to university. My dad lost his father when he was 7 years old, and he was able to complete schooling only because of the largesse of his elder brother and an elder sister, and therefore joined in the clerical grade in the Indian Railways. But he was incredibly passionate about giving me and my younger brother, who incidentally also shares identical credentials. IIT Kanpur, IIM Ahmedabad, and then worked JP Morgan Chase in New York, and now is a professor at ISB, Indian School of Business, having done his PhD. So my dad really sort of gave us what he could not get in life. I think that way, so I had a very, very, I mean, not that me or my brother were ever short of, the basic necessities. We had actually all of that. My dad had a, had a job, as a, in the Indian Railways. But unlike, most people who sort of get into the IITs, and kids of professors, bureaucrats, none of that for me or my younger brother. And I think that is something, though, I'm very, very proud about, in the sense, and I attribute it completely to my father's hard work, determination, and his ambition as well. So that's what, so I came from, even though my mother tongue is Tamil, born and brought up in Madhya Pradesh, because what was at that time Madhya Pradesh, to now Chhattisgarh. My father used to work in Southeastern Railway, so I've actually moved around a lot of places. Why IIT Kanpur? Truth be told, it was just a dream. When I was preparing for the JEE, IIT Kanpur just seemed like a dream. I actually remember this instance, when I started preparing, there used to be these Agrawal classes that I'd taken, that material, and they used to send photographs, put photographs of the top 100 rankers. And, I still remember counting the number of people who did not have spectacles in those photographs, because I didn't have spectacles either. And I used to go and tell my dad, all these look so bright to me, all wearing spectacles. How am I going to ever actually, so in that sense, and looking at those people and seeing many of them going to IIT Kanpur, at that time, if you recall, in the 90s, IIT Kanpur was the best, university, IITs actually. So it was a dream, and that's why I ended up going there. And I think one of the, aspects that I've discovered in life is that oftentimes our aspirations are set by the, by the peers that we are part of. Having gone to IIT, then I think, listening to a lot of peers, I think that helped. But once I went to the University of Chicago, there I used to see people, especially faculty, professors, talk about impact, having impact on society. And again, that is something which really stood with me. One advantage I've had is that right from a very young age, I've been very clear that, money is not going to bring you happiness. Doing something that actually leaves an imprint, I think doing stuff for others, I think, brings you far more happiness. And at the same time, I've had this clarity that I want to make choices in life that will make me happy. So I guess it's a combination of all this. At the same time, I will be absolutely, honest to mention that there's not a slice of luck. There's like a heavy dose of luck, in being able to chart through these things. Oftentimes, being at the right place at the right time, one cannot deny that at all. Again, as I said, Endaru Mahanubhavulu Andariki Na Vandanamalu, so many great people who possibly, do not get such opportunities. I've been very, very privileged to get it, and thank the Almighty for that.
Terrific. We may have to diversify you away from Tyagaraja in just a second, but before we get there, tell me a little bit about your Chicago stint. I mean, you had the privilege of working with two giants, Luigi Zingales and Raghuram Rajan, who you already mentioned. And both of them are known for that, what should I call it, eclectic market orientation, sort of this notion of fair capitalism, right? And Zingales in particular has also talked heavily about competition being the real genius of modern economies. So at a conceptual level, apply this to India as a young man coming back from Chicago, and now as a much wiser man, however, 25 years later, how does that intersect with our innate tendencies towards statism and our innate tendencies towards cronyism, despite the rhetoric of every single political party? The orientation seems to run a very strong thread in our political economy. So how do you dent that, if you believe in it?
Yeah, I think these are 3 or 4 questions rolled into one. So let me start out by, at the time when I was doing my PhD at the University of Chicago, I think I was fortunate that it was a time of incredible intellectual churn at that time. And so, for instance, while we had the efficient markets camp headed by Eugene Farmer, it was, at the same time we had Richard Thaler, and a lot of his, colleagues doing work on behavioral economics. We also had, at that time, we had people like Gary Becker, George Stiegler and others, and Raghu and Luigi, who were actually saying that, oftentimes it is actually the capitalists that undermine capitalism. While in every word of theirs, they may actually talk about competition, in every deed of theirs, they actually try to undermine competition. I think that gulf between thought and deed, and the governance aspect that is important to sort of bridge together or bring together this, or reduce this gulf between the word and the deed. I think those were ideas that actually really stuck, very well with me. I, for instance, do remember my dad talking about how even in India, the many times the elite have actually, speak one thing and do one thing, and so it resonated, that those ideas resonated very well with me. So I think that, University of Chicago actually, at least during the time that I was learning, was a period where I sort of learned to appreciate the nuances, which is that, while markets definitely work very well and competition is really important, but markets don't work all the time. And I think the fact that the global financial crisis happened while I was just sort of, building up my own research, portfolio, also highlighted to me, and, Luigi in particular has actually written on the fact that the, global financial crisis was a failure of trust, was a failure of governance, and in the country that has taken, or at least till that time, always prided itself on its governance, etc., which sort of, really drove home that there is no perfect sort of economy or society, that you have to keep working on these aspects. Now, the second half of your question, I will differ with the way you framed the question. Yes, I think last 65, 70 years, and starting with the undermining of institutions under Indira Gandhi, I think we have actually gone the way we have. 97% marginal tax rates. If that does not, I think Laffer curve, was basically just thrown into the trash can. That was the period that led to the creation of the black economy, and overall, Article 356, basically governors and chief ministers being replaced at a whim. All the emergency, or the undermining of institutions started with that time. But more broadly as well, this entire license permit Raj and the planned economy was one that basically I think ignored two important aspects that economic policy must take into account, which is incentives and information. When you basically centralize everything, all economic activities, and especially focus it on the public sector, neither incentives nor information work for the economy. They end up both working against the economy. But let me take a much broader spans here. And I think you were saying about statism, lack of competition, etc. If we take a sort of stab at history over the last 200, 250 years, I think that may certainly appear so. But a lot of Indians don't appreciate the simple fact. This is work done by Angus Maddison, published by the Oxford University Press, that up until 1750 AD, India accounted for at least 1/3 of the world's GDP every year, every century. That is 3/4 of known economic history. Let's not ignore that. And the way we did that actually was, if you go and think about it, competition and actually liberal ideals were really important part of it. Was, as I've covered in the 2020 economic survey, it was the marriage of the invisible hand of markets. The language was coined by Adam Smith, but in spirit, this is what we basically encourage trade, and the hand of ethics or dharma, was something that was very important, consistent with a very deep spiritual, and cultural traditions. And I think let me end this comment actually with, see, we've always been a polytheistic society. The West, on the other hand, has been a monotheistic society, and this entire, if you think about it, the democracy, capitalism, the limited liability enterprise, all of those actually evolved from the Protestant movement, which itself was an endogenous response to the excesses by the church. And therefore, a lot of innovations that came about in the West were from the separation of the state and the church. And that's a right model for them, given the monotheistic society. When you start thinking about India, on the other hand, and this is something I tell my kids, our gods compete for our attention. Think about it. We can be, a Shaivite. We can be, a person can be a Vaishnavite, can be an atheist, can be a Shakta, can be actually, Bhakti Marga, Gyan Marga, Karma Marga. There are so many ways, and therefore our gods compete for our attention. Competition is something that is absolutely innate to our culture. So let's not basically go and indulge in this idea that everything that is great about economy is actually something that's borrowed from the West, something that I genuinely don't believe in. And having read not only modern economics, but also having read Indian literature very well, I actually say that with authority, that this conception that all economic ideas are basically just come from the West is not true. And that's something we've covered. If you go and read Arthashastra by Kautilya, or you go and read Tirukkural, in my native mother tongue, Tiruvalluvar, many of these ideas were very much there. And I think as Indians, we must acknowledge and recognize that there are optimal ways in which societies are built. A monotheistic society, one church, one pope, which is basically for the West. I think the separation of religion and state, the way they think about it is right for them. But for us, a polytheistic society, I think there are the combination of church and state. That's how it has been. And let me end by saying, metaphysically, if you take the numbers 0 and 1, they're poles apart. Numerically, 0 and 1 are actually next to each other. 0 is basically shunya, nothing. And that is the Western model, no religion in state. That is the model of governance. The Indian model of governance has been of one, Sarva Dharma Sambhav. I think these are aspects that we have to really, think about deeply, rather than just becoming actually, because of the English education that we've had, just sort of parrot stuff that we might have learned. These are very important aspects that we must be, introspecting on.
So if I may push you there, and I might go straight to the topic of public economics, and I certainly am not celebrating any Western economics here. I do think, though, that we must adapt whatever the body of knowledge from the past, both ours and other people's, into the best possible way going forward. So do you think the government should work, for instance, on denationalizing public sector banks?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And what would be the conditions that would create that? I mean, clearly Indira Gandhi nationalized them mostly for political reasons, though subsequently rationalized as economic ones. And perhaps it stood the test of time, at least early on, but now clearly it's a time of the past. Would you apply your lens, not mine, on 70% of the banking sector being, in that sense, subject to the high command, so to speak, and where it goes from here?
Very much so. In fact, I think, in my opinion, and I'm absolutely clear about that. That is one historical mistake, a Himalayan error that actually India has paid for, for in huge terms. And let me give you some facts here. If you just go and plot the the credit to GDP ratio, start in 1960. Take India, take Malaysia, take Canada, UK, Australia. Plot on the one hand the private credit to GDP ratio, which is basically how much credit is going into the economy, how well is the banking sector actually helping the economy, and at the same time also plot GDP per capita. How that has, it's a telling tale there. I have actually done this now. If you try and do that with any other metric, be it the government spending, any other macroeconomic indicator, no other indicator has that mirror image. The way the GDP per capita has grown for these economies, actually, which have grown significantly, and how credit increase actually contributed to that, is just a story in itself. The fact that India has actually lagged behind so much is because of this Himalayan error, in my opinion, of nationalizing the banks. If they were supposed to give more credit and actually reduce really, rationing of credit in the economy, and yet let's face the facts. The private credit to GDP ratio in India is 58%, with large sections of the population still not getting credit. It's only in the last 7 years, because the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, that financial inclusion has really increased, 400 million accounts being created. Before that, for almost 70 years, we basically did nothing really much on financial inclusion. If you look at even the ratio of credit that goes to small firms, SMEs, MSMEs, etc., that proportion has not changed much over the last 3 decades as a proportion of the overall credit itself. And I think this is a very important aspect, that credit actually, which is what really leads to M3, the broad money in an economy is about credit, and that's one area that India has singularly lagged behind. At 58%, if you take the average for OECD economies, that average is close to 160%, almost 3 times as much. We've singularly lagged behind in terms of the credit, and we've had problems of basically, even when credit expansion happens, we end up doing not giving credit to the right people. And that is why, if you look at the policies and that have been pushed over brought about in the last 3 years, not just in the context of public sector banks, but overall for the entire economy itself, I think one of the aspects that we have brought about is the enterprise policy focused on the private sector. This was part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat announcement, which basically says that except for 3 or 4 sectors, which is your strategic sectors like banking, oil and gas, defense, etc., where we may have 3 or 4 state-owned enterprises. So collectively, maximum 25-30 state-owned enterprises. Every other state-owned enterprise will be privatized or closed down. What you're seeing, in the Air India privatization, the announcement of privatization of 2 public sector banks, 1 insurance company in the last year's budget, all that is actually activation of this very, very important change in policy that has been brought about. So, I would conclude therefore by saying that the policy that has been enacted is actually very, very consistent with, what I have genuinely believed, that, assets of the economy need to be in hands that will run them efficiently. And that is, except for a few sectors, must be in the hands of the private sector.
So, Subbu, you led the writing of 3 of these surveys over the last 3 years. Tell us a little bit about how a survey gets written. Is it Subbu dreaming up 7 or 8 ideas and then socializing it and saying, hey, these are good ones? Is it somebody from the other side of the road, the South Block, that calls and says, how about including a few of these? How does it work? And then how does the work actually get done?
So, I don't know whether you had the opportunity to see the statement that I had put out. I said there that the economic surveys carrying their free spirit over the last 3 years, a lot of credit for that should go to the Honorable Finance Minister. And it is in that context that I mentioned that, I have found her to be a scholar in spirit, a scholar at heart, because, I can say this, and, you will, my statements will not change even after I finish my tenure, that I've had the freedom to actually come, and bring the ideas that I have wanted to, and I think it's important to recognize that if you look at the sort of let's just take the 2020 economic survey on ethical wealth creation. That was the theme, and that theme actually got inspired. If you the speech that the Honorable Prime Minister gave from the ramparts of the Red Fort, in August 2019, he spoke about wealth creator. He spoke about that we should be respecting wealth creation. That is when the idea triggered in my head that this year, the theme should be wealth creation. Before that, the 2019 survey, we wrote on the $5 trillion economy and a strategic blueprint for that. Why? Because, the new government had come into power and wanting to actually, sort of do good work. And because this was the first economic survey of a new government, I thought, what better than to actually lay out a strategic blueprint for an important goal for India, which is becoming a $5 trillion economy. I think, that blueprint, together with the focus on ethical wealth creation and the last year's survey, which was on the COVID economy, the need for counter-cyclical fiscal policy, all of that together, I think, have sort of set an economic template for India to really follow. And that is something that typically you would, trust economists to be able to bring those kind of thematic ideas. I think then if you're able to infer, carefully there, therefore the ideas have very much come from, where they must come from. No top-down, pushing of these ideas. In terms of the process itself, it has taken almost usually 6 months or so to actually, right from the conceptualization stage. And, usually these would start with a meeting that I would have with the senior people in my team, saying this is a theme that we can think about, for this year's economic survey. Can we sort of a brainstorming session there, and then thinking about some of the chapters, because one of the key things that has distinguished the last 3 economic surveys from previous ones has been that each survey has had a theme to it. So all the chapters are therefore built into a theme, and therefore from the theme the chapters have evolved. And I have a very wonderful team of people, of Indian Economic Service officers, especially some of the younger ones, who actually understand how to do rigorous empirical work to actually back those ideas. A last point that I must mention actually is, given the deadline there is, and you have to not only write it in English but also get it translated into Hindi. I have found that apart from having Saurav Ganguly's attributes of selecting a very good team, it is equally important to also follow Dhoni's model of remaining calm under pressure. Inevitably, when there is a deadline and translations have to be done, all kinds of processes, there is there can be stress. But I think one of the things I've believed is that the team always looks up to the leader to actually, convey the faith that, it'll come what may, it'll get done. And so I think that calmness is another aspect that is very important, because, I've genuinely believed that a creative team always works the best when it is happy, when it is relaxed. And I think it behooves on the leader to actually create that environment, for a creative team to be relaxed, to be happy, and say, whatever stress you have, give it to me. I'll take care of that. You just focus on doing the creative work.
So do you typically talk to states or the State Planning Commission in the erstwhile context, or any of these entities when so let's say, assume you came up with a theme of a $5 trillion economy. I get it. You got a team going with it. How do you deepen the idea or take threads on the idea? Is it sort of a very eclectic combination of individuals that you call, or is it much more systematic in the sense of Niti Aayog and the states and so on?
So, it's a combination, Narayan, because one thing you have to remember is that, you have to maintain very strict confidentiality, because, this is, it is the privilege of the parliament to actually see the economic survey for the first time, and therefore, all through the process of building the idea, or, and crafting it out, writing it out, and, the printing process, everything, it's very important to sort of maintain that very high level of secrecy, at a similar level as the budget itself. And I think, in that sense, therefore, you have to sort of the organizational model, if you will. I think it's just a word that I'm using for want of a better word, means that, there has to be a certain number of people that can be involved. Usually, it does involve, interactions with ministries on specific, aspects. For instance, if, when it is about macroeconomic, aspects, that consultation, that discussion can happen in the finance ministry itself. But if you take, for instance, let's say the healthcare chapter that we wrote, a chapter on healthcare that we wrote in this year's economic survey, another chapter on the PMJY, the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana. Now, these are basically chapters that clearly relate to the healthcare, health ministry as well. So we would actually consult with them as well. So that's how this process typically works. I think it is important to sort of be departed enough, in the sense that, only then can you sort of bring in the objective thinking, but at the same time also involve, those that have the ground realities, involve them enough as well. I think that sort of Goldilocks balance in some sense is very important. Either extreme, I don't think actually would work very well.
Terrific. Let me switch to some of the ideas that you've embedded in your surveys. And while I do that, let me just say we're probably about 10 minutes away from completing this segment. So if you want to think up your questions, please do so now, and you can start posting them. I see the first question has appeared already. So just a little heads up for the audience that you may want to wake up a little bit and post your questions.
Are you suggesting I'm putting them to sleep, Narayan?
I don't think so with your energy, but you never know. These are IIT guys. They may work only nocturnally. So, no, but I think with your energy, I'm sure everybody is awake. So let me ask them to post. And I already see one. So it's you always have to ask. So, so in the first survey, and you mentioned this already in the sense of private sector credit to GDP, but let's turn to private investment itself. It's been rather a disappointing and somewhat anemic figure in India for quite a long time now. And this is not a political statement; it's an economic statement. And we have gone down from sort of the tiger economy 30s or early 40s down to the high 20s now in terms of total investment. And that includes now a stepped up version of government investment, which is good. So tell us, what is it? What has happened since the global financial crisis, including all the various activities that both UPA 2 and NDA 2 and 3 have conducted, that this remains as anemic as it does, because in a manner of speaking, if you think of economic growth in very simple terms as C plus I plus G, I has been anemic. G has picked up, which is good, right? Not government consumption so much, government investment, which is good, at least in relative terms to government consumption. And
Right.
C is modest or moderate because of, and we'll get to it in the Q&A, because of the inequality as well as because of the lack of private sector credit. So tell us about I and why I has stayed small I rather than big I in the last 10 years.
Yeah, so it's a combination of factors. Let me sort of, take a backward sort of stance on this. In other words, talk about the more proximate and then, talk about the less proximate. So the more proximate cause, and I'm talking about here from around 2016, 2017 onwards, has been the dual balance sheet problem. I think the up until 2014, the one big thing that that has really sort of affected the economy is the crony lending that happened, and the bad debt crisis that was created as a result of that. I think many of us might have watched this show Bad Billionaires on Netflix. That's sort of a illustration of this phenomenon of crony lending that went on. The reason actually this is something that I particularly bring about is because if you look across the world, not just in India, anywhere in the world, if the financial sector and the banking sector in particular is messed around with, the overhang that it creates is actually far longer than when the when problems originate from the real sector. There's a lot of research by financial economists on this, but I'll give you some specific example. Let's take the global financial crisis versus the COVID crisis, for instance. Last year, the global economy had by far the lowest growth rate in almost a century, right? While this year it's bounced back, very quickly, and we're going to have possibly the highest growth rate for a long period of time. So, a very quick, a steep decline, but followed by a quick recovery. Similarly, if you take the 2001 tech crash, for instance, and there was actually a slowdown then as well in the US economy, and some of the other economies too, which was because of the again from the real sector, tech sector. In contrast, take for instance the global financial crisis, or take the Asian financial crisis, both of which were financial crises. The global economy took a long while to evolve from that, with several European economies, particularly Greece, Ireland, etc., suffering from sovereign default issues. So the overhang that comes, and similarly the Asian financial crisis as well, many of the East Asian economies actually suffered an overhang for a long time. The simple point, therefore, being that when problems, happen in the financial sector, first thing that happens is it takes a while for those problems to be discovered, because loans are typically 5 to 6 years, along in maturity. Only when these loans come back for repayment do you actually find out that these have been lent to cronies who actually are not likely to repay. Add to that incentives that banks will typically have to evergreen those loans, and also to continue zombie lending. You add those agency problems that you typically see, you have the financial sector overhang because of problems in financial sector lasts a long period. So this is something we covered in detail in the 2020 Economic Survey, Volume 2, Chapter 1, analyzing the slowdown itself, where we showed that it started from the lending, had its problems then on investment, because you had the dual balance sheet problems where corporates were over leveraged, banks also became extremely over leveraged. Corporates then wanted to unwind on their debt, basically could not take on debt or did not want to invest. And then once that cycle happened, banks did not want to lend, because there was actually a lot of the crony lending, there were measures that were taken, which then end up adding risk aversion. I think the risk aversion aspect is still to get over. So that's sort of the the most important cause for the slowdown in investment, in the last 7-8 years is basically because of the financial sector problems. Before that, I take it as primarily because of the shock, from the global financial crisis. There was basically a demand side shock, and companies did not anticipate as much consumption possibly. Also, that entire decade from 2004 to 2014, we did not do any reforms at all. And I think that is something which is very important. And let me be very clear, in a democracy, the economics can never ever be departed from the politics. Political economy, especially when you think about reforms, etc., it's incredibly important to recognize that economics doesn't happen in a silo. So when there were no reforms, the shock to global demand, and a lot of the decision making not going very well, was a period where reform, the economy was crying out for reforms and did not happen. In contrast, what we had was a lot of paralysis in decision making. The combination of both of those, I think, has really brought down in investment rates going forward. And so let me, using the same diagnosis, let me also give you a prognosis then for the future. The reforms that we've done, especially the capex by the government, and we showed this in this year's economic survey, that typically we think about government spending as having the effect of crowding out private investment. That's the sort of the traditional argument that is made, and which is true for advanced economies. But we showed it that for an economy like India, and especially during a time when the economy, sort of going through a slowdown or a decline in growth, then that period, I think the spending by the government on infrastructure, capital expenditure crowds in private investment. So that's the first thing that has been done, to really boost investment rates. Secondly, actually, one of the reasons why investment has not happened is because India really suffers from a lot of supply side frictions, and that is why the emphasis has been on the supply side. If you think about it, demand remains primarily at the top 25-30%, of the income pyramid. Top 25-30% consume most of the demand. Especially at the bottom of the pyramid, these are people who typically need organized sector jobs, to be able to create, demand in a sustained manner, and more construction sector activity, because a lot of people, migrant labor, works on construction sites. And so the fact that there hasn't been enough capex, not enough investment rate, means that consumption also gets impacted thereby. So this virtuous cycle, starting from private investment onto productivity gains, thereby jobs and wages, which goes on to disposable income, thereby consumption, anticipated consumption, then driving more investment, and so on, is something that virtuous cycle first started slowing down, and I think during the period of the pandemic has been actually has slowed down even further. So I think these reforms, especially focused on the supply side and the capital expenditure push, especially on the infrastructure side, will really bring back investment going forward.
So we started with your future. Let's end with India's future, if you don't mind. Just let me give you free form to prognosticate, but on a wider canvas, perhaps the next 10, 20 years. Where do you think India will go, and in order for it to go in that direction, what reforms are required, or what it's predicated on? And with that, we'll open it up for Q&A. I think that's a good segue into getting people involved in the discussion. So please go ahead.
So I think, Narayan, it would be germane here for me to point out these seminal reforms that have been done over the last 18 months. These reforms, whether it's labor market reforms, the enterprise policy focused on private sector that I mentioned, the farm bills, the telecom sector reforms, the production-linked incentive scheme, the decline, the corporate tax rate cut to 15%, the change in MSME definitions, opening up of defense production, mining, and so many sectors. The financial sector, the development financial institution, creation of the DFI, privatization of 2 public sector banks, the increasing the FDI limit in insurance to 74%, creation of the bad bank. When you put all of this together, the emphasis on the reforms has been on primarily the following aspects. One, it is to ensure that the manufacturing sector really picks up in India. If you look at the manufacturing sector, historically, India manufacturing sector has suffered from, 5 or 6 problems. One is that power costs are high, logistics costs are high. The firms typically are much smaller than the optimal scale. They do not generate economies of scale. Therefore, labor actually, because of the stringent labor laws that we've had, we don't, for the price that you pay, basically quality adjusted, you don't get, the price is very high, and cost of capital also has been very high. All these together then mean that the cost of production for manufacturing firms in India have been much higher than those in their global counterparts. And that then affects their ability to compete both domestically and abroad. And these reforms that we've done, the labor reform, the change in the MSME definitional changes, the farm bill, the financial market reforms, the enterprise policy focused on private sector, thereby privatization, all these are intended to really bring more vitality to the manufacturing sector. And this is important because jobs in the organized sector will be created for our youth in manufacturing, and that can really help increase demand in the in the lower half of the income pyramid, if you will. And I'll give you this example. Some of the inspiration here is from the New Deal that President Roosevelt launched in the United States. Cities like Detroit actually became such hubs of activity because of the creation of large middle class from jobs created in the manufacturing sector. I think that is something that India needs. So that's the first aspect. Secondly, related to that is also to actually bring demand and more aggregate consumption at the at the lower half of the income pyramid by creating jobs, and through infrastructure, through the many of these reforms aimed at efficiency gains. What we are pushing for is increase in private investment rates and increase in efficiency or productivity of assets. If you take privatization and asset monetization, these are intended to be so. So I would say, therefore, from the push on both investment rates and the productivity of assets, I would say this decade, India should have growth close to 6%, sorry, 7%, close to, so we expect growth to be between 6.5% to 7% in the next year. This year, we expect growth to be in the double digits. Next year, which is FY23, between 6.5% to 7%. And then as the impact of these reforms start showing up on the ground, growth accelerating to 7% plus. So I think this decade, I have a lot of belief that this will be a decade of inclusive growth because of the seminal reforms that have been implemented, especially focused on the factor markets, over the last one and a half years.
Terrific. Thank you for that very high energy, high octane engagement, Subbu. So let's turn our attention to some of the questions that have shown up, and I'll try to separate them into the threads that I'm seeing it in. Interestingly, one thread appears to be pretty much where you just spoke about this idea of inclusiveness, but the questions come from sort of from inequality side of the discussion. And Vineet Bakshi and Sandhya Chandrasekharan ask, it only seems to me to be that income inequality is growing rather than shrinking, number one. And number two, how exactly does the ethical wealth creation, not her words, but mine, trickle down in a way to address income inequality? So perhaps you can take a couple of questions related to inequality and why it appears that we're diverging rather than converging on this issue.
Okay, so this is going to be a little bit of a longer answer because it's such an important question and a lot of misconceptions often remain. So I wrote a chapter in the economic survey this year, which was titled Growth and Inequality, Convergence or Conflict. And Vineet and Sandhya, I would request you to go and take a look at that chapter. I'll try and give you the gist, but let me start with an example. many of us have watched Malgudi Days in our young times. The main protagonist there, Swami. So there is this episode, if I remember right, where Swami comes back, crying to his mother. He comes and hugs his mother and tells his mother, "Mom, I scored 100 out of 100 in my maths exam, but the principal, because my friend Shankar scored only 60, the principal took 20 marks away from me and gave it to Shankar so that Shankar and I could actually have equal marks." So then, Shankar, on the other hand, actually, the episode moves along. Shankar, is very happy, goes to his mom and says, "I got 80, even though actually I should have gotten 60. Then Swami basically asks, saying, after that, saying, for the next exam, why should I study? Because, if I'm going to work hard to get 100, the principal is always going to take 20 marks away from me. What's the point of me studying? On the other hand, Shankar says, I don't have to study at all because anyway, I'm going to get 20 marks, additional. So I think this example and the fact that then the final argument that Swami makes is saying, why doesn't the principal give additional help to Shankar so that he can also score 80 and I can keep my 100? I think illustrates some of the nuanced arguments that are very important. In economics, it's not just what is obvious, but what is beyond the obvious that we should think about. That's the first aspect. In other words, the effect on incentives, that's something we have to keep in mind. But that said, actually, and just conceptually, I wanted to frame the point. In the Indian context, and I think many of us have actually read Thomas Piketty's work, and I think it's good work focused on the advanced economies. But what we must remember is not to cut paste, those arguments from the advanced economies onto a country like India. And I think the best example to actually tell us or remind us about that is the pandemic year itself. The fact that because of the pandemic, we had a 7.5% decline in GDP, and what that has meant is that inequalities have exacerbated. Together with that, also put in the fact that after 1991, because of the liberalization and the higher growth, poverty has been reduced, at a much higher rate than ever, in independent India. So I think when you put these two together, it is very clear that growth is far more important for the less privileged sections of society than for people like us. The very fact that the pandemic year, a decline in GDP has meant that the less privileged have actually been more impacted than us, I think should remind us that growth is incredibly important but that said, I think we cannot just leave, growth to do its job. Welfare is incredibly important as well. And that is where growth is important, because the resources to do welfare will come only from growth. So India's, India's objective, and that's the way sort of we like framing it, is that in terms of objectives at the macroeconomic level, India has to focus on growth and growth alone, so that the resources are generated, for us being able to do, welfare. And if you see over the last 7 years, I think that's been one of the main accomplishments of this government, which is that, the welfare programs have been administered much more efficiently. A lot of the pilferage, a lot of the, wastage that used to happen earlier, through the combination of the Jam Trinity, and other measures that have been taken on the governance side, welfare has become far more efficient. So the holes have actually been plugged much better. So we need to actually push growth so that the pie expands. From the expansion in the pie, we actually are able to generate resources to do more efficient welfare, so that we address inequality through two counts. One, growth itself actually lifts people above poverty, but at the same time use the resources that are generated from growth to do efficient welfare to also address inequality. And I think in that context, therefore, growth is very important, as is efficient welfare.
Could I just ask an addendum question, which is there at the bottom of Vineet's question, which is, do you think that the investments in the input to growth, or at least the long-term input to growth, which is education, health, research, and innovation, is sufficient, or do we need to accelerate its sufficiency given its current path? Now, health But when do we go from quantity of education to quality of education, for instance? When do we go on the quality of higher education? We have been focusing so far on primary school education and so on. So any thoughts there? And then
Yeah, no, I think, very good points. I like thinking that, and I often distinguish between the necessary and the sufficient. I actually, in fact, think that, healthcare, education, these are necessary. I don't think anything is really sufficient as such, from a growth perspective. And I think that is the impatient person in me speaking, I guess. We have to think about education and, healthcare, as part of building human capital, and human capital, I think, is incredibly important. Healthcare, if you see, the pandemic has clearly highlighted the role of healthcare, and I think this year's budget, the 135% greater allocation for healthcare, including both prevention and cure, and I think that is recognition of what Benjamin Franklin said very eloquently in 1736, that an ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of cure. So the focus on, for instance, the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan on cleanliness, the clean water, which is the Jal Shakti mission, these are all part of the cure, of the prevention. At the same time, we also showed in this year's survey how the Ayushman Bharat, and especially the insurance part, the Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, PMJAY, and we showed it with careful data. By the way, these are not administrative data sets; these are data sets put up by the NSSO, based on national surveys of the highest quality. We showed that the insurance program has had a very salutary impact on healthcare outcomes. So on top of that, now we're actually going into digital Ayushman Bharat, with, I think, with a combination of telemedicine, and other aspects of technology that have actually become, have come into the spotlight as a result of the COVID pandemic. So I think on healthcare, the necessary steps have been taken. Education is something that more needs to be done. I think the national education policy is a very important step in that direction. Implementing the aspects of that, I think, will be very, very critical. At the same time, also, I think, and the NEP has important parts of vocational training also in it. So we need to sort of engage with not just the IITs, but also the ITIs. And, I think private sector needs to engage with the ITIs, in building more vocational skills, looking at the curricula that ITIs have, identify maybe 15, 20 ITIs that are the best, and really work with them to actually, it can be a win-win for the private sector. These are aspects that I think we need to work on. I think in some, I would say human capital is incredibly important for growth, especially inclusive growth.
Perfect. You mentioned the importance of growth, Subbu. Let me, if you permit me, add the word low inflation or moderate inflation growth, because it's pertinent to the next question. I presume you will agree with it, with that addendum. And if you said that one major objective for India is growth at moderate inflation, let me ask you the question that Raghuram S, not Raghuram R, asks. There was a debate on printing more money to spruce up demand. Is this a relevant debate in the Indian context? And maybe you can broaden the question to answer the question about counter-cyclical fiscal policy. How much is enough? How much is affordable? And what is, in your view, an acceptable debt to GDP standard for a developing country like India? Should we be watchful, or get the patient out of ICU and then we'll figure out what to do when you're normal?
Yeah. Again, I think 3-4 questions rolled into one. So firstly, I think whoever has asked this question, I would encourage him or her to go and look at an op-ed that appeared, I think, day before yesterday or before. This is an article by Ruchir Sharma, And I think, in fact, if you go and read some of the commentary that was made by by various commentators a year back, all of them were saying, we need to do more on demand. And now, the same folks are basically saying that countries which tried to do a lot on, by revenue expenditure have benefited, absolutely nothing, in terms of the of growth. And I think that is something that a view that we had very clearly. We distinguished between revenue expenditure and capital expenditure, and demand versus supply. And I think revenue expenditure does not build assets in the economy. When you don't build assets in the economy, I think the economic outcomes that we faced after the global financial crisis in India is, I think, a telling lesson for what not to do on economic policy. At that time, we only did revenue expenditure. Fiscal deficit for India increased to 6.5% when the peer economies were at 2.25%. In other words, we were more than 2.5 times the peer economies on fiscal deficit. We had a current account deficit that was close to 6%. Inflation that was in the double digits for every month for almost a year and a half. And that is despite, no lockdown, no night curfews, none of the supply side disruption that has happened during the pandemic. And I think that actually tells you how bad the policy was at that time. Why? Because it was policy that was only focused on revenue expenditure and just increasing demand. And I think this is Econ 101. I actually, because there might be audience here that may not be, familiar with some of the economics, I must point out that I think the two key tools that economists can never ever let go, even at the highest level of policy making, is demand and supply. If you increase only demand, you do nothing to supply, then what happens is your price level increases, quantity does increase, but at the macroeconomic level, that what happens is you get inflation. When you get inflation, monetary policy cannot be supportive. So whatever demand side push has been given by fiscal policy, monetary policy will unwind that, so fiscal policy has increased demand, monetary policy a few, maybe quarters later will unwind that. So whatever growth push you got, will basically, undo that. And this is exactly what happened during the global financial crisis. In contrast, if you increase demand and you increase supply as well, and you can do these charts actually on, on paper, you will find that the price level does not increase that much. If price does not increase at the macroeconomic level, that translates into, inflation not being a problem. And that is what has happened despite very stringent lockdowns, despite, night curfews, etc. Inflation over the last 1 year for India has been 6.1%. And after a little bit of a, blip, above 6% in the second wave, has cooled down to 4.5%, in the last several months. And that, I think, if you can compare with the global financial crisis without any lockdown, without night curfew, tells you the telling impact that supply side measures, which we identified very early, have had on, that's the first point I want to mention. In other words, supply side measures are very important policy that is only focused on demand, and that too through revenue expenditures. I think we've seen that after the global financial crisis is a recipe for disaster. India became part of the fragile five through very high inflation, very high current account deficit, and very high fiscal deficit. In contrast, now all three metrics, India is actually quite comfortable. Second aspect, and that is something which India has done, is focused on capital expenditures. And I think that's something which I've already highlighted. Capital expenditures create assets in the economy. Assets actually increase production and thereby increase supply. And that is why supply side measures, important. At the same time, on demand as well, and I did refer to this, that when you have capital expenditures going up, you have construction sector activity that goes up. Construction sector activity creates a lot of jobs, especially in the informal sector. Migrant labor, for instance, work a lot on construction sites. So demand goes up as well in the process. I think these are important nuances. And if you contrast India, not only now vis-a-vis the global financial crisis, but even India vis-a-vis the rest of the world today, where supply shortages are really biting. to the extent that the last issue of The Economist, the title of that was the shortage economy. The shortage economy clearly tells you about the supply side frictions. Again, because the global economy has focused only on demand side measures, which have really not yielded as much bang for the buck. Capital expenditures actually being a lot more bang for the buck. And I'll end with this piece of research, which is, an IPFP, showed in the Indian context that if the sovereign puts 1 rupee in revenue expenditure, for ostensibly for demand creation, the addition to the economy is between 92 paise to 98 paise. In other words, between 2 to 8 paise gets lost, and the economists call that deadweight costs. In contrast, if the sovereign puts in that same 1 rupee in capital expenditure, the addition to the economy is about 4.5 to 4.8 rupees. Now ask yourself, how would you, if you were investing your money, you would never ever invest that money, put 1 rupee and get 92 paise, or, or 90 or up to 98 paise. If you, in contrast, put 1 rupee, get 4.5 rupees, you will certainly do that. And that is what is the dharma of a policy maker as well, to treat the taxpayers' money in the same way as they would invest their own money.
Shifting tax a little bit, another question from Bharat Sherman, and this sort of connects CEAs across time, let me put it that way. Your predecessor who shared at least some part of your name with you. Thoughts on universal basic income? Is it required? Is it a policy instrument that that India should utilize? If so, when? And I guess this is the flip side of the earlier question on inequality. Should we be bringing a law that somehow limits the extent of private property? Good gosh, you're asking a Chicago man this question. But anyway, let me ask it, because that's what the decentralized method of asking questions generates. So,
I think let me take on the second part of the question right away. Bad idea. I think, both, let me say it right away, both, aspects that I asked, both bad ideas. I'll come to the UBI, later, but let me talk about, first, ask yourself this question. Let's say I'm an industrialist. I'm not, but suppose I was an industrialist. And let's say, I have money. Do you think I actually, that money, I stack it up as notes and sleep on that? Ask yourself that question. I don't do that. What would I do? I would actually go and, put it in a company. That company would create factories, that those factories would employ people, and as a result, people get jobs. So I think we have to understand this very well. I'll give you a more prosaic example. When we were young, there used to be this rhetoric. Many times, actually, if you looked at the richest person in the town, have you ever thought that richest person in the town, how many jobs did he create versus, let's say, households like us? Households like us, for instance, many times did not even have, a fraction of a maid. We did not keep a maid. Even when we had a maid, typically that maid would be working across 5 households. What does that tell you? That each household like ours was giving basically 1/5 of a job, of a maid's job. While the rich person, and by the way, this is not, I'm just saying economics, no value judgments here. The rich person may have had one, person to drive his car. They gave a job for as a driver, a person to maybe walk his dog, maybe a person to take his, maybe his wife, or if it is basically a woman, maybe the man to be groomed, kids to be taken care of, babysitters. So the number of jobs that the person creates, I think, we really have to understand that economics, actually, in economics especially, what is obvious oftentimes is wrong. To say that, oh, just because somebody has money, I don't think that person, sits or sleeps on bags of money. And let me say it, by the way, lest this thought is mentioned, that none of this is coming from any conflict of interest. All through my 20 years, I've not a single paisa of consulting income have I actually earned. So these are all based on my own convictions, and not speaking for anybody or against anybody. These are economic principles that we have to honor if you have to see India actually, growing well and becoming a prosperous society. So anybody who attributes actually motives to this, let me make it very clear right away. Now let me come to the first part of the question. Therefore, on universal basic income, bad idea. There's a lot of countries which have shown clearly, without going into details. I think an absolute precondition for that idea to work is that all the existing subsidies will have to be replaced by a universal basic income. And let me tell you right away, impractical. I think these are ideas that actually generate a lot of media attention and traction, but in terms of the practical utility, I don't see too much.
Okay. So the next set of questions, Subbu, are related to Subbu. So let me, and perhaps we can close with those. So let me ask them together, and then you can take your time answering them. So one question is actually a little bit more generalized, which is, and I can see there's a little mischief in the question, which is, please share your experience on the selection process to become a CEA of Government of India. This is asked by Ramakrishna. So let me ask you that question, and then I will get to the other two in a second. So
yeah, I think it's an innocuous question. I don't see any mischief there, unless.
Okay, sorry. Maybe I shouldn't pass any judgment. It's up to you to answer. So please go ahead.
Yeah, it's a process where at least I can speak in my case. I don't know about the others. In my case, there was an advertisement that went, that was put out by the government. People had to apply, and then there was a search panel that was headed by eminent economist, former CEA and former RBI governor and member of parliament, Dr. Bimal Jalan. Dr. Bimal Jalan, had headed a search panel, and that panel actually interviewed a lot of people. I don't know who else was interviewed, but I certainly went for that interview, and based on that interview, the selection was made. I think finally it goes to the appointments committee of the cabinet. That's the process. I would think that others, in other cases also, the process might have been very similar, but I'm not aware. I can't speak about others' processes. So I think that's a typical process that goes through for CEA, I guess.
So when you took over, Subbu, it took like 6 months before there was a long gap, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
Is that par for the course, or is that why does it take so long? Or particularly since you must have given them some notice on this, wouldn't it have been already in motion that they would want to, particularly given, I think, again, that if the budget is indeed in February or late January, that the next survey is already due in a way?
No, in fact, the reason I actually made the announcement and and started the process early was precisely for this reason, that I wanted to ensure that the transition is quite smooth.
Okay, so very helpfully, an anonymous attendee, that's literally the name, asks, why not consider another term for 3 years for the country's sake?
No, I think all that I had to say on this count, I've said it in my statement that I had put out, both on Twitter and on LinkedIn. I don't have anything additional to add on that. I would refer you to that statement to take a look. Sum and substance, I think it's been an incredible privilege, to serve the nation. I have genuinely felt it every day, and I still feel it as well. But at the same time, even as a researcher, especially in a country like India, with so much to do in terms of thinking, careful thinking, I think there's a role to be played in serving the nation as a researcher as well.
What's the first course you're going to teach when you get back to ISB? What's it called?
Well, I can't, I can't tell you that because I don't know at this point. But I used to teach this elective class on corporate control, mergers and acquisitions. So as a professor of finance, I used to teach. That's the class I used to teach. We'll see what would be the course that I would be teaching. It's not yet finalized. I'm not avoiding the question. It's not finalized.
Okay, we'll save the questions for the market for corporate control and auction systems and how best to get public assets into the private market for another conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure, but let me ask you very, very last question. What does a man from IIT, IIM, and Chicago do for fun?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. There are a lot of things that I do for fun. So I sing, and
Oh, I think we actually might have 2-3 minutes here.
No. Are you asking me to sing?
Well, how about just the, little charanam from one of your Tyagaraja songs?
No. Maybe so. Let me first answer the question.
Yeah, please. Yeah,
so
sorry.
I sing. At times when I feel like it, I sketch as well. Of course, in terms of I really love watching cricket. I've been a big fan of cricket, played cricket, and also watched cricket. And I also love movies. So I love watching movies. So yes, these are ways in which I actually sort of unwind. And I of course, like many others, do enjoy reading books as well. Typically, I don't read that much fiction. Mostly read non-fiction stuff, but I enjoy reading. I love listening to music too. That's something which especially some of the some of the bhakti-oriented songs. That's something which somehow I identify. For instance, one of my all-time favorites is the Nama Ramayanam by M.S. Subbulakshmi, and similarly the Annamacharya Kirtanas. That's something which I enjoy as well. So let me, given that, let me just an Annamacharya Kirtana that I really enjoy. I'll sing just maybe the first part of it.
Please, we'll be delighted. So please go ahead. Yeah.
Bhavayami Gopala Balam Manasevitam Tatpadam Chintayeyam Sada Bhavayami Gopala Balam Manasevitam Tatpadam Chintayeyam Sada Bhavayami Gopala Balam Manasevitam Tatpadam Chintayeyam Sada Kati Ghatita Meghala Khachitamani Khandita Kati Ghatita Meghala Khachitamani Khandita Patalanina tena vibhrajamanam Kati ghatita meghala Khachitamani khandita Patalanina tena vibhrajamanam Kutila pada ghatita Sankula shinji tenakam Kutila pada ghatita Sankula shinji tenakam Chatula natana Samujvala vilasam Bhavayami Gopala balam Manasevitam Tatpadam Chintayeyam Sada. There's one more, but
Fantastic. Thank you. I think I should let the audience know that this is perhaps the first place, the IITACB Center, where you've heard Rag Yaman Kalyani as the way to India's economic future. So with that, I will conclude, and I will turn it to Sushila to give the give the mangalam to what Subbu just spoke. So please go ahead, Sushila.
Yeah, can I come in? I just wanted to ask one question. Of course, my name shows us Dr. Subramanian, I don't know how, but this is Ashok Misra. So I wanted to ask you, one thing which you didn't touch upon is how the share markets are booming. And you talked about economy going not so, this thing. I don't see the correlation. I wonder why that is. That's one question. And then I have one more small question after that.
Professor Mishra, I don't think I actually, in any of my responses said that the economy is not doing well. Let me be very, very clear. There has been a, V-shaped recovery that has happened. And as I mentioned that this year, we expect the GDP growth to be 10%. And as for your question about the, stock market, see, as a finance professor, I used to teach that the value of a stock is the value of the assets in place plus the value of the growth opportunities that the firm has. That's the, conceptually, that's how one has to think about the value of a stock. And that's why, firms like Amazon or eBay, when they listed, even though they were making losses, they had very high prices because of the value of the growth opportunities. Now, if you take that concept and, then just do a convex combination, a linear combination of the various stock prices, that's what an index essentially is, right? It's a weighted average of the stock prices of, maybe 50 stocks if it is the NSE 50. And so the same concept then actually can be, because it's just a linear combination, same concept applies for the index as well. So the present value of the assets that are part of the index and the present value of the growth opportunities, or if you look at the entire stock market itself, it's the same concept. So, given the reforms that we've done over the last, over the last 1.5 years, the present value of growth opportunities has increased significantly. And that is what is reflected in my opinion. And last point, typically when you think about if there is a bubble in the stock market, financial economists use the not only the level of the stock market, but we also look at volatility, which is captured by the volatility index. Typically, bubbles are identified by high volatility combined with high levels of the index. And I think I've been watching this carefully. The volatility index, if anything, has come down. I haven't seen it over the last 2-3 days, but up until at least last week or so, VIX had actually been coming down. So I actually would therefore attribute at least a good part of the, the index value to the present value future growth opportunities. There is some bit, of course, because of the liquidity that is sloshing around, some part of the, the values are definitely because of that, but I wouldn't attribute, a large part of the stock market value to that.
Okay. So, thank you. This was, I think, a very, very interesting discussion, and thank you, Dr. Subramanian, for this. And Narayanan, I must thank you for enabling such a very insightful and wide-ranging discussion today. Thank you so much. We started with a little peep into who our chief economic advisor is, and I think we heard Subbu articulate some of the tenets, some of the basic principles of his own life and his beliefs. We had an interesting discussion about the economic survey, how it's written, etc. And, the fact that there is a theme that the economic survey in recent years has been built around. I found that very interesting. I think one of the biggest takeaways for me from this session has been the idea that we need to find solutions that are appropriate for India and in sync with our culture, our belief systems, and our value systems. I really am very happy that you've really articulated this in a very forceful manner. Thank you again for that. And somewhere I thought there was a suggestion that we need to go deeper into understanding who we really are, because that is what is going to bring out the best in terms of what is appropriate to us and the best in us. we had, and I think you also brought out some rather interesting and startling concepts, such as competition is an old Indian concept. I had never ever looked at it that way. So that was interesting too. Dr. Subramanian then talked us through the reforms in various areas, such as labor reforms, the farm sector, telecom, investments, etc., etc., and what impact these have on our country's performance. One or two take important, I thought, points that stood out. One was the importance of not fiddling around with the financial sector, because any kind of fiddling around or unsettling of the sector is going to create some waves that are going to hang around for a long time and are very difficult to kind of get over in a shorter period of time. And in that context, the denationalization of banks, which is inevitable and which we expect to see sometime soon. The importance of bringing private sector involvement and investment and private investment into most sectors except a few strategic sectors. And much of that can actually be propelled by the government making investments, capex investments in many of these areas, because that is, especially infrastructure, because that is what is going to then create the impetus for private sector to come in. The idea of ethical wealth creation, which was the theme of the whole 2020 survey. And I think you said somewhere that it is already a part of the Indian DNA. And again, that's interesting. Why supply side reforms are critical and what needs to be done about it. Why manufacturing should pick up and become and make India actually globally competitive. And again, we looked at a number of aspects around all of that. It is important to bring increased demand in the lower side of the income pyramid, because eventually that is what is going to drive the whole idea of inclusive growth, etc., is going to come from there. I thought this whole discussion was was a very hopeful one, and while we all kind of sit around and bemoan the fact that the world is falling apart, etc., etc., I think some of the ideas that you brought up, Subbu, here are so important for us to remember and take away with us, carry with us. The idea of inclusive growth, which needs welfare measures, but that is only possible if there is growth. The importance of health and education, they're so critically important. Prevention, which by the way is a subject completely after my heart. That's an area that I work in, and and the many Government of India schemes that are focused around this. So these I think are really nice ideas to bring together on top of a discussion around the economic reforms. So we've had a wonderful conversation today, a really, really nice conversation. And personally, I take back the fact that we are on the verge of something wonderful happening, a great transformation, which will move this country forward and make us, take us to definitely the 5 trillion economy, but much more than that as well. While I expected discussions around policy and reforms, the economy and so on, what I certainly did not expect was dharma, tyagaraja, all of that to be part of today's discussion. What came out very strongly, and I think that is what comes out in many of your other discussions that I came across online as well, is your passion for India, and that came out again strongly today. So thank you so much for anchoring it around all of that. You talked about your passion for ideas and the fact that ideas outlive us. We're going to miss you as the Chief Economic Advisor, but I'm sure your students are going to be very, very inspired by you. So good luck with what you're going to do, and we hope that you will continue to be actively involved in all of the future dreams that we as India have. And with this, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, and that lovely little song as well. Thank you. It was wonderful. And thank you, Narayan, once again.
Thank you.
Thank you all. That's a wrap.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Subbu.